We are here with Dr. Simon Whitney, who's a family medicine physician and ethicist. He's also a recent author of this excellent book about institutional review boards titled From Oversight to Overkill: Inside the Broken System That Blocks Medical Breakthroughs and How We Can Fix It. Simon, welcome to the External Medicine Podcast.
Glad to be with you.
Before we get started, do you have any financial disclosures?
Yeah, I poured a lot of money into this.
A lot of money into the research for it, or?
This is an important topic, but my position is unpopular, and I've never gotten funding for this work. Actually, that's not quite true. John Tyson at the University of Texas provided me with some salary support at one point, but there's no commercial funding, and John hasn't sent me much money for a long time now.
All right. Well, I guess let's dive in. How did you get interested in this topic? And maybe give a brief sketch of some of your background for anyone who's unfamiliar with who you are.
Sure. Well, I started out as a family doctor, and I was in private practice in Washington State from 1982 to 1994. But I got interested in medical ethics, questions of assisted suicide, right to treatments, various other issues. And I decided to, when you argue with people about these things, usually you say the lawyer says you have to do this, you can't do that. So I decided to go to law school so I could argue back. I went to Stanford Law School, and while I was there, I studied medical ethics, and I spent a year as a fellow at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. This is helpful because the IRB system, which we're going to be talking about, is a legal system that operates in the field of medicine and is perhaps governed by ethical principles. So we have law, medicine, ethics all involved. And my background in all three areas helps me navigate this more comfortably. I didn't know the IRB system existed until I wanted to do a survey as a law student of doctors' attitudes toward physician-assisted suicide. And my advisor said, well, you've got to get the IRB approval for that. I said, really? To send doctors a question about how they feel about assisted suicide? He said, I think you should check with them. And the IRB staff confirmed, yes, indeed, your research could pose a risk to your doctor subjects. Suppose one of them answered a question about their views about assisted suicide, which might be illegal, and their views became known in public. It could be a problem for them, and even answering the questions could be problematic. And I've known a lot of doctors. I've never met one who had such a fragile ego as to be troubled by these issues, but the IRB thought it was a problem. So I went through the process of getting IRB approval, which took forever, in part because they wanted to approve every single change the questionnaire was sending. That was my introduction to the downside of IRB research supervision, how it imposes significant burdens on research that itself poses only trivial risks.
So from that first encounter with an IRB and having to jump through the hoops of getting permission, I forget the exact terminology that Carl Schneider uses for that type of regulation where you have to get approval at every single level as opposed to just blanket approval at one particular stage. But there's some term that he used for that. At some point after that, you found yourself actually working on an IRB. How did that come about?
Well, after my difficult and really humiliating experience with the Stanford IRB, I did the only logical thing and joined it. And so I was on the IRB there for a couple of years, and it was educational to watch a group of committed senior professionals doing their very best to protect subjects from harm in a system that was not well designed. But we on the IRB did our best. And I should make very clear that I think most people on IRBs serve diligently, they work hard, they do their best, they're usually unpaid, and in exchange, they mostly get grief from their colleagues. So the problem in the IRB system is not the IRB. The problem is the way they are supervised by federal officials and the way those officials are motivated by Congress. Problem is strictly upstream from the IRB.
Event licensing. That's what it was. That's what Schneider called it.
That's right. He's thinking in terms of constitutionality and impermissible restrictions on free speech.
I guess now I'm assuming most people listening to this will know what an institutional review board is, but for anyone that's unfamiliar with that topic, how would you define what they are and what they do?
In response to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which is a very dark stain in American medical research, in response to that and other research scandals, the IRB system is set up in which there is an IRB or an institutional review board at every institution that does research with human subjects in the country. And big medical schools, little universities, biotech companies, they've all got IRBs because they all have to have IRB approval to do any research involving human subjects. This is a very sound idea. There's nothing wrong with making sure that subjects aren't being abused. But this sound idea has been taken to lengths that have become ridiculous. And as a result, most of the IRB's efforts today slow research, damage research, delay important findings with no measurable benefit whatsoever. They've become a real problem.
Well, we'll get to the Tuskegee experiment, but maybe it's going to be helpful to go back and talk about, as chronologically as possible, the history of how IRBs came to exist. And maybe along the way, we can introduce some of the characters that you do so beautifully in your book, people like Henry Beecher and James Shannon and Chester Southam. And maybe let's start with before World War II and then after World War II up until the 1950s. What was research like at that point, and what were research ethics like at that time?
Well, before World War II, there was important research being done, for instance, in polio, and there were ethical questions there. But we didn't have the research institution that we have now. Federal funding for research was much smaller, and the issues just were not that prominent. Then during World War II, James Shannon, who was a New York University physiologist and renal specialist, was charged with doing federal research on malaria. Malaria is a big problem. We were about to go into war in the Pacific with the Japanese, who kept the entire supply of quinine, the only effective medication, locked up. And during the war, the government discovered that if it put big bucks into medical research, remarkable things could happen. And so after the war, Congress said, hey, why not apply some of this money and manpower and knowledge to the problems of peacetime life as well? Why not work on heart attacks and infections and other problems? And so the NIH kept on pouring money into research of all kinds across the country. This was a tremendous boon for medical research and for patients whose lives were being saved by the millions. The problem was that with all that money going to all these different researchers, it's kind of inevitable that some of them became tone deaf to the ethical problems involved in doing research on humans. Chester Southam was one of the best examples. He was a very smart cancer specialist and researcher. And he said, if we want to fight cancer, maybe we should find out how the body itself normally protects itself against cancer. And so he tried injecting, among other people, prisoners at the Ohio State Penitentiary with a suspension of live cancer cells. He had a pretty good idea they weren't going to be harmed, but the wardens said, you still got to tell these guys what you're going to do to them. He told the prisoners exactly what he planned to do, to give them a suspension of live cancer cells under the skin to see how they reacted. He was hoping to get about 25 volunteers. He got about 5 times that many. People were lining up to help. And he did the injections. Nobody had a problem. I mean, they developed swellings under their skin where the cancer was, where the system was fighting off the cancer. And their system always won. The cancers all went away. He had important data about how the body fights off cancer. So far, so good, right? But he wanted to see if the body's ability to fight off cancer was lessened for people with chronic diseases. And in New York City, in Brooklyn, there was the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, which had a lot of people with chronic diseases. And so he proposed going there and doing the same experiment there. The only problem was he didn't tell them he was going to inject them with live cancer cells. And when news that he was doing these injections got out, there was a tremendous uproar. And the government was sued, the hospital was sued, and the NIH was able to fend off the lawsuit, saying it was just a local decision-making process the NIH couldn't be responsible for. But that alerted NIH officials, including James Shannon, who was now in charge there, to the risk of research like this. And taking this problem into account, along with several other problematic experiments, Shannon said, we've got to have a system to keep this from happening. Now, the NIH already had a system in place for its own researchers in Bethesda, in which research that posed significant risk would be reviewed by a board to make sure the risks were reasonable. Shannon said, let's just require this nationwide. And that's how the IRB system morphed from a NIH-only procedure process to one that applied across the country in every institution. And this was a good idea. We don't want to have researchers abusing subjects. And if you have thousands of researchers, some of them are going to make big mistakes unless you have somebody looking over their shoulder. So the basic idea of having an IRB system is a sound idea, and I support it 100%.
There's a little bit of an irony there in that the prison system, the warden of that prison that you were just describing, insisted on the autonomy of prisoners to be informed of the experiment happening, whereas this same experiment happening in a hospital was done totally unbeknownst to the patients who were injected.
It's a sad irony, and Southam didn't have to do that. He was a creative, resourceful guy. He could have found other ways to get the data he needed, but this was the easy way. And he said that he didn't want to tell the people in the hospital what he was doing because mentioning cancer would provoke their phobia and ignorance. Well, phobia about cancer is something I can relate to. And I think they had every right to be concerned about it. Now, the injections, in fact, did no permanent harm to anybody, but that's not the point. The point is that this gross breach of their right to decide how their bodies would be used. They had every right to refuse, and he was wrong to not let them do that.
Yeah, and the way that he introduced that he was going to do this experiment, I think in your book, the way it's described is, I'm going to inject you to test your immunity. And people are like, okay, yeah, sure, I guess, yeah, check my immunity. And then he injected that. I think it was like 20 something people at that time. There were a few other experiments during that time period that ended up having a dramatic effect on the way James Shannon and Henry Beecher and some of these other people were thinking about research ethics. One of them was the Willowbrook experiment. Do you want to go ahead and give a description of what that was and how that impacted the ultimate development of IRBs?
In the 1950s and 60s, hepatitis was a very serious problem that was poorly understood. We know now there are several different kinds of hepatitis. They're spread in different ways. Back then, it was just known there was this disease that affected the liver that could kill you if you were an adult, or could perhaps have no effect on you at all if you were young. And so the government wanted to figure out what was happening, and it funded research at the Willowbrook Institute for the cognitively disabled, where hepatitis was an ongoing problem. The problem was that these disabled kids and young people would play with their feces, as they do everywhere. And that's one of the most effective means of spreading hepatitis. And so Saul Krugman, who was the researcher, set up a separate ward for newly admitted kids where they would not be exposed to other risks like measles, for instance, and where he could give them hepatitis of the local variety and watch what happened. And watching what happened turned out to be very interesting, because you could have a young child infected with the hepatitis virus who showed no sign of illness, who gained weight, who was normal in every other way, but who had slightly abnormal liver tests and could in fact transmit the hepatitis to somebody else, like for instance to a nurse. This kid with the mild hepatitis would give the infection to the nurse. Now, a nurse is an adult who got hepatitis was likely to be flat on her back in bed for a month or two, feeling just terrible. So this research became the subject of great controversy. There are basically two sides of opinion about it. One is those who said, these kids were not visibly harmed, we're learning a lot, and we are protecting nurses from having a very serious illness. This is important research and we should do it. The other side says, wait a minute, that's just an elaborate rationalization. You are giving hepatitis to children on purpose. There is no justification for that. And the Willowbrook experiments are a controversial subject on which ethicists still do not agree. I think it may be partly whether you relate to the nurses who were serving in a high-risk area and needed help, or to the children who had done nothing wrong and got infected. And so we still don't agree about that, but it brings forth the ethical issues that are involved in these cases.
I think the point that you made in your book, which was interesting to me, was the comparison also is not just between infecting children versus not infecting children, but the rates of spread amongst the hepatitis spread very quickly amongst children who are not in the study as well. And that the some of the defense that was used was the fact that, well, this spreads rampantly through the institution. All we're doing is taking this and studying it, I think was one of the justifications as well.
That's correct. They were likely to get hepatitis regardless. In my mind, one of the important voices in this is the voice of the parents. There's a parents association at Willowbrook, and they were concerned not only with their child, but I think with other children, because they gave Saul Krugman a plaque honoring him for his pioneering research. So although their children had been part of the experiment, they were fully in favor. That doesn't mean they have the ethical final answer, but I certainly treat their opinion with respect.
Were they informed of this research and the potential to infect their children prior to it being conducted?
Yes, they were. There's some debate about how fully they were informed, but over time, as the ethical perils of the research became more apparent, Krugman got more and more careful about fully informing them about everything he was planning on doing. They knew what they were getting into. They knew what their children were getting into. But they also knew that the children would be in a special ward, protected from other infectious diseases, given more nursing care than was common, and watched carefully. They also knew that none of the children who'd been infected had suffered serious problems as a result.
All right, well, let's introduce another main character in this story, Henry Beecher. Maybe give some background on who he was and his reaction to the Willowbrook study and what he did at that point.
Yeah, this story really features two major protagonists, James Shannon, the government scientist, clear thinker, good elbow bender, procurer of funds, sponsor of research, a consummate scientist, administrator, and a very solid guy. That's on the one side. On the other, we have Henry Knowles Beecher, who would make me tear my hair out if I had any hair left. Beecher was born Henry Unangst, Unangst, in Kansas. And when he moved to Boston to enroll in Harvard Medical School, he changed his name to Beecher. He wanted to be perceived as one of the Boston Beechers, the eminent line that goes back a couple of hundred years, whose names are distinguished in Boston history. So he simply declared that he was a Beecher and claimed to be a Beecher. And so we start from this very dubious ethical beginning. And yet Beecher had a very keen awareness of right and wrong. And he was an anesthesiologist. And in the OR, he would read the journal articles describing advances in medical research in the post-war period. And when he saw that people in service, in other words, soldiers and sailors, had volunteered to participate in the study, in which some got an effective antibiotic against their infection, and some did not. He didn't believe they had been told what they were choosing to do. He didn't believe they had been told at all. And he felt it was very wrong. He was appalled by this. The people who were doing the research, we assume, thought that, gee, if you can take, let's say, 80 soldiers and sailors, give half of them a great antibiotic, give half of them an ineffective one, and if perhaps 5 have serious complications from the infection. But if this proves how ineffective the old-fashioned traditional antibiotic is, then you could save thousands or millions of lives as a result of this direct study. That's utilitarian calculus, saying let's sacrifice a few if we can get a benefit for a great many. And Beecher thought that was wrong. He said emphatically more than once, we have no right to make a martyr of anyone for science. So he started keeping track of these cases that he considered ethically wrong. And he launched a major campaign to persuade the medical establishment to take a closer look at his own research practices. And he failed. He kept trying and he failed again. He published a major article that failed too. So finally he said, I'm fed up with this persuasion behind the scenes. And he published an article with about 25 egregious examples of what he thought was unethical research in the New England Medical Journal of Medicine. And he made it a point to notify the media about this long before the media had a medical desk at all. But he made this a big deal. And he brought public awareness to the problem of unethical research. He did not make the IRB system happen. That actually had already happened. But he brought unethical research to the public's attention. And that was a great service. And Beecher is revered in ethical circles today, and with good reason, because this was something people didn't know about, society needed to weigh in about. The medical establishment had been unwilling to police itself. This made it clear that society cared, and that made a difference.
It's interesting, the relevance of bringing things to the media. There's another, I won't say counterpoint, but another important example of a story being brought forward to the media. That is Peter Buxton's uncovering of the we could call it the Tuskegee study. We could maybe call it more accurately the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study. I think before we get to that, eventually after something on the order of a decade of him talking about and trying to bring awareness of this study to it actually getting published in the New York Times. But can you start off just by giving us a little bit of backgrounds on the U.S. Public Health Service study in Tuskegee, what the objectives of this study were, and how that went down?
In about 1932, the Public Health Service, which was very concerned about syphilis, which was a major health problem for which there were no effective treatments. There were treatments, but they were not very good, decided to see if they could identify all the people in a specific area, find the ones who had syphilis, and treat them. That sounds like a good idea to me. And they chose an area around Tuskegee, Alabama, and they identified hundreds of people with syphilis, and the funding kind of dried up and went away. This was during the Depression and just wasn't going very far. And so the Public Health Service sat back and said, what do we do now? We've got no funds to treat these people. Well, I thought the obvious thing was just to follow them and see what happened, because syphilis is a complex disease that shows itself in many different forms, either soon after infection or much later. And this was, this gets back to, this is like Chester Southam and the cancer injections. If they had told the men involved in this study, you've got syphilis, we want to follow and see what happens with you, we'd like to do regular exams, in exchange for which we'll give you some kind of a benefit. And of course, if treatment becomes available, we'll treat you. That would have been quite reasonable. These were very poor men. They had no access to medical care. They weren't going to get treated anyhow. And if they had been told what was happening, that would have been, I think, not crazy. But instead, they lied immediately and continuously. And when penicillin became available in the late 1940s, they kept the men from getting treatment at that point. When the study was reviewed by a federal panel in the late 1960s, the panel decided that the study should continue, and they noted that all the subjects were African American, and they noted that the study couldn't be repeated today because that might not have very good optics. Never did they say, this is wrong, we shouldn't have done it. Never did they say, this is racist, we should have begun it, we should stop it right now. They just kept on doing it. It's just, it's appalling. And actually, we have so much argument about diversity, equity, and inclusion nowadays. If you look at the men who were involved in supervising and conducting the study, they were all white. I think if there had been one black face among the physicians, among the researchers, among the administrators, they would have realized that this should not have begun and should not continue, but they didn't. So along comes Peter Buxton. Buxton signed on with the San Francisco Department of Public Health to stamp out venereal disease, and in particular syphilis, which is the only one that routinely killed. And Buxton went from door to door in San Francisco's downtrodden neighborhoods, knocking on people's doors and saying, I've got news about your test result. Can we chat for a minute? And the people learned from him they had syphilis. And if they said, I feel better now, thank you, the rash has gone away, he would say, that's just how tricky syphilis is, because the rash goes away, but down the road, let me show you what can happen to you. We pull out a photograph of syphilis victims in the later stages with terrible complications. He'd say, now we can keep this from happening. We've got a treatment for you, and I want to treat you. Come down to the public health department next Thursday. We'll get your treatment started. And by the way, I need to know who you've been sleeping with. We want to treat them too. That was his job, and he thought it was important work. He felt he was saving lives. He couldn't have felt better about what he was doing. And then one of his older colleagues said, in Alabama, they're keeping people with syphilis from being treated. He said, basically, this cannot be true. So he wrote the CDC, requested copies of relevant articles, and discovered that, in fact, the Public Health Service had been doing a study of untreated syphilis. And in order to do that, they had been keeping people from getting treated. This blew his mind. He had been working so hard to get people treated, and his boss, the Public Health Service, was working to keep other people from being untreated. Buxtun was a refugee from Nazi Germany, Nazi Czechoslovakia, I think, actually. And he made the connection between what the Public Health Service was doing in Alabama and what the Nazis had done in Europe in no time flat. And he wrote the CDC more than once to say, what are you doing? This is terrible. And they paid him a little attention or a little more attention, but they never took him seriously, never stopped the project. And he couldn't believe it. And even when he had just nothing happened, even when he left the Public Health Service and went to law school, he would sit around over dinner and talk to his friends about what he had found. And one of them was a cub reporter for the AP. And she said to herself, there might be a story here. She went to her bosses. They assigned a senior reporter to it. And that's how in 1972, news of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment became public news on the headlines of America's paper.
All right. So all of a sudden, revelations of the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study appear in the major newspapers and people start talking about it. And how does Congress react?
Really, this is where the problems began, because Congress said we can never have something like this again. And so the IRB system, which is already operational, was then settled into federal law. The statute says you will have an IRB system. Here's how it will operate. Here's how it will protect research subjects. And if you look at the IRB system as intended only to protect research subjects, that turns out to be an unbalanced approach that is prone to going off the rails. Because actually, the goal of any system of oversight is not only to keep research subjects from being harmed, in which case you could simply stop doing research. The goal is to prevent harm to research subjects and to permit research to continue. And you have to balance both those things and keep them both in mind. But because the system was set up only to prevent subject injury, it disregarded the needs of all of us for more research for better treatments. And as a result, it has increasingly over the years slowed, damaged, delayed research of every kind. That's the problem. And that's why the book is called Oversight to Overkill. Oversight is a good idea, but when taken to the point of overkill, not so much.
Can you talk a little bit about the Belmont Report of 1978?
That's right. Congress could have identified the problem with the Tuskegee experiment, with the U.S. Public Health Service experiment, as being racism, because that was obviously its problem. But Congress did not want to do that. And so instead it identified the problem as lack of ethics and lack of proper process. And so Congress said, let's set up a system that is designed to be ethical from the beginning. The Belmont Report was the federal report that identified the ethical principles that should undergird the proper conduct of research. And so when the system was set up, ethics was intended to be part of the system. And I think in the early days, there were, I'm sure, IRBs that tried their best to integrate ethics into their decision-making. The problem is that in 1998, that Congress leaned on the federal administrators who were supervising the IRB system and said, you guys aren't being tough enough. And the federal administrators said, okay, Congress wants us to be tougher. We will. And they shut down temporarily some or all federally funded research at a dozen major institutions. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but you're talking many millions of dollars and tremendous disruption of research of every kind. Studies can't continue. Subjects can't be enrolled. Data can't be processed. You can't go to conferences. You can't do anything. And it was a body blow to those institutions and a serious warning to institutions everywhere. The IRB's primary goal maybe should not be ethics. Maybe it should be avoiding the federal hammer. And from that day to today, ethics has been out the window, and avoiding federal punishment and other repercussions has been their main concern. So while the system talks about ethics and presents itself as ethics and thinks it's ethics, it's not. It's protecting against risks of various calamities the institution is afraid of. That's not ethical. That's just covering your ass.
So I want to talk about some of the studies that you discuss and some of your cost-benefit analyses that you've done with regards to the ISIS-2 study, which doesn't have any relationship to the Islamic State and was conducted in the 1980s on myocardial infarctions and the Pronovost study and some of these other studies that you go through. But maybe before we get to that, can you just talk a little bit about the institutions that are involved here, the OHRP, and how IRBs become something that is required by all academic centers who accept federal funds?
When people think about medical research, they mostly think about drug development and the FDA. And the FDA is in the headlines practically every day. The FDA has thousands of employees, a budget of the billions, and oversees a major portion of the US economy: drugs, devices, and biologics. That's what people usually think about. OHRP, which is the agency in charge of the IRBs I read about, is an agency with a staff of, I think, 29, and a budget in the modest number of millions. And so that's one of the reasons nobody's ever heard of it. But it has tremendous power over all research that's federally funded and that doesn't involve drugs and devices. So, for instance, OHRP sets the rules for what consent process must be used in research of any kind. This was the ISIS study that you referred to, which was a natural experiment in obtaining consent to conduct heart attack research. It was a multinational study led out of the UK, started enrolling subjects in about 1985. And there was a theory on the part of some cardiologists that if you administered clot-busting drugs, you might save lives in a heart attack. There was a theory on the part of a lot of other cardiologists that you would get strokes and bleeds and you'd kill people. And so when the cardiologists are nearly at blows, that's the perfect time for a trial to see who's right. So ISIS was a major international study looking at that question. And it was I said it was a natural experiment because there were different forms of informed consent in the US and the UK. In the UK, as part of your routine admission to the hospital with your heart attack, the cardiologist would say, we're going to take good care of you here. We're going to give you oxygen, morphine for your pain. Here are the visiting hours. We'll do anything else you need. We're doing some research here, and you may be part of that. Also, your family should know that if they have any questions, they should approach me directly. That was the informed consent process in the UK. In the US, there was a rather lengthy single-spaced form that described all the pros and cons of each of the clot-busting drugs involved, and then informed people of important facts such as aspirin could taste bitter, If you're on a gurney in the ER, having a heart attack, in pain, in stress, frightened, you may not care that aspirin could be distasteful. You may not care that the FDA reserves the right to inspect your records, or that your privacy will be protected to the extent protected by law. You may not care about any of that stuff. But this form is so cumbersome that the U.S. cardiologists were very slow to recruit subjects. Because we were slow to recruit subjects, the study was delayed by perhaps 9 months in terms of its findings. The findings were dramatic. The clotbusters reduced mortality by about 40%. That's an amazing reduction. Now, even so, 9 months delay may not seem like a lot, but at that time, there were about 190,000 heart attacks in the US every single year. If you could have saved 40% of even some of those lives, the numbers add up very rapidly. And so because of that delay in completion of the study, we estimate, Carl Schneider and I estimate, that between 3,000 and 9,000 people lost their lives. If this were a different kind of outcome, it would have been a tremendous scandal, people losing their lives for this. But the people who died, who could have been saved, were mixed in with others who could not have been saved. We'll never know which 2 out of 5 didn't have to die. Now, this is what the economist Alex Tabarrov calls the invisible graveyard of people who weren't saved but could have been. Their families never knew that they didn't have to die. But we know it now. We just don't know the particular people involved. The size of the numbers involved is staggering, but the people who support the system simply dismiss this evidence as unimportant. They won't address it. They won't touch it. Ethicists, as a rule, think that this system, more or less as it is absolutely essential and should not be tinkered with. And that's why there are so few of us speaking out against it. I'm not alone. There are other ethicists who feel the system has gone off the rails. And there are many scientists, those of your listeners who are in a medical school setting, if you just mention the word IRB to one of your faculty members, I can pretty well guarantee they're likely to roll their eyes because the IRB is widely seen in medical circles as a waste of time and energy and a generator of unpredictable obstacles that is protecting people from harms that often simply don't exist. So it's well known in the medical school circles as a problem.
It's interesting. The original studies that we were describing are issues of either autonomy, lack of any form of consenting process, be it just even just explaining what you're requesting a participant in a study to do. And when we get to the 80s, in the period that you could describe as being the maybe golden age from 74 to 98 of IRBs, prior to Gary Ellis cracking down on IRBs and causing institutions to increase the number of individuals who are actually involved in IRB oversight. But even in that time frame, whenever this was, in the early 1980s, if you were having a heart attack and you went to a cardiologist who was not participating in a study, who really, really believed that streptokinase and aspirin were going to save your life, you would have been given that. And if, on the other hand, you had gone to a cardiologist who didn't believe in either of them, you wouldn't have been given either. This study was merely testing what two cardiologists believed was in your best interest. And I think that a lot of the creation of IRBs is designed to mitigate institutional disaster and prevent the most egregious racist policies from being instituted. But now We see the effects on actually preventing the development of knowledge in ways that you would have been treated anyhow, even if this study hadn't happened. You just wouldn't have been enrolled in a trial.
That's perfectly put, Mitch, and it makes me very sad. We allow doctors, as one English doctor wrote, I am permitted to give any treatment I choose to all of my patients, but I want to give it to half and not to the other half and keep track of the results. That requires an elaborate series of permissions. It just doesn't make sense.
So let's go through some of the other case studies that you go through. Let's start with Pronovost's checklist at Johns Hopkins. What was the study and what light does it shed on the OHRP?
Peter Pronovost and Sean Barinholtz, his collaborator, did a fascinating study on reducing infections in intensive care units caused by large central IV lines. And they had no new treatment. They had no new medication. But what they did was they found a way, using a checklist, to make doctors who were inserting these large central IVs follow the procedures they were supposed to be following already. It turns out that if you are busy intern on a crowded ward, with a list of 6 things to do and a page from the emergency room about a new admission, and you need to put a large central line in, and they don't have a full-length sheet, sterile sheet available, you will use a half-length sheet because you need to get things done. But the full-length sheet protects against infection better than the half-length sheet. So Pronovost and Barinholtz set up a system, making sure the doctors had the supplies they needed, and a nurse was watching to make sure that they actually did it. This worked very dramatically. I mentioned the 40% improvement in mortality from the heart attack study. Well, this showed a 100% improvement in mortality from this particular kind of infection, an amazing result. And so they said, let's see if this applies elsewhere, if we can make it work elsewhere, because if you're in their own institution with them making rounds every day, of course, things are going to go well. But what about somewhere else? So they agreed with the Michigan Hospital Association to try it out in a bunch of hospitals in Michigan, large and small, wealthy and poor. Think Henry Ford in Detroit. And it worked just as well there. And as they were in the process of rolling this out and showing that it worked and counting the numbers, the OHRP, the federal agency, came in and said, hold everything. You should be getting consent for this research you were doing. You should be getting consent from the patients whose lives you were saving. And you should be getting consent from the doctors whose work you were improving. And you should be getting consent from nurses who are helping this all work. These demands could not realistically be met for many reasons. And the research was thrown into a temporary halt. And the unusual thing that happened here was that this case became widely known. Usually when the federal agency shuts down a study, it's little heard about in the press, little mentioned, and the scientists involved take their lumps and move on. But in this case, there was a big public uproar. Atul Gawande wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, if this is what OHRP is doing, Congress should set it straight. And OHRP rapidly backed down. When asked why they had taken this action, which in truth really defies logic, the OHRP chief said, well, there was a danger the quality of care could go down as part of the research. That you can't make this stuff up. People were dying less and less. So of course, you'd be worried about quality of care going down. This kind of oversight is driven by external concerns, by OHRP's desire to look tough, I think. And since scientists in general are not really bad actors, looking tough has undesirable consequences.
On the topic of looking tough, I know that we kind of glazed over this briefly, but if I'm not mistaken, Pronovost checklist, that was after the 1998 crackdown on Hopkins IRB. Is that correct?
That's right.
Can you go into why OHRP cracked down on Hopkins in 1998 and what was happening at Hopkins that led to this to begin with?
Well, there were problems at a couple of places. A young man named Jesse Gelsinger was part of a gene transfer experiment at Pennsylvania in about 1998, and he died. And there were other places where there were lesser problems. Hopkins had a research death, I believe before that, of a young woman in an asthma experiment. So there were problems that happened, although there were significant problems had occurred. The gene therapy death could really not have been anticipated because this was a brand new reaction. No one had ever had it before. The asthma death was unfortunate, to say the least. But the motivation for OHRP's crackdown was congressional hearings at which the head of OHRP, Gary Ellis, was grilled by congressmen on why he wasn't doing more. They made him look like a fool. They asked him how many IRBs his agency was supervising. He had no real idea. And the congressmen who know how many people are in their district and how they vote, how they live, and what they do, were not impressed. And they said, maybe we should shut down OHRP. So Ellis went back and it decided to get tough and started shutting down institutions. And when there was a reason to be concerned, he used that. When there was no reason to be concerned, he found something trivial, failure to document that a quorum was present for each vote of the convened meeting. I mean, this is not a reason for shutting down research. And when research was shut down, it was typically shut down across broad areas of the institution, not just the particular experiment or lab that was involved in a particular problematic area. It was just everything was shut down. So the response was wildly disproportionate to the problem. And that's what made administrators so frightened of federal action, what has made them so cautious from that day to this.
It's striking to me how many scientific breakthroughs there were in the pre-IRB age, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. And I think that there's even been some literature on more disruptive technologies being developed during the first half and second half of the 20th century compared to now. And I wonder if there's some type of trade-off where the more we restrict what a scientist can actually do in the name of safety, the less innovation we end up getting afterwards. Even if you're arguing that the set point of that should be notched a little bit more towards innovation, I wonder if there's just an inherent trade-off here. And this, I think, in particular, rings true with the Jesse Gelsinger story, where after that, it was a tragic thing to happen, but after that, we discovered IL-6 and tocilizumab and all of the people who are able to be saved now because that was developed. You don't want bad things to happen during research. But to some extent, if we, as you said before, if you just shut all the research down and now everyone is safe from research, then you don't get innovation which ends up saving people in the future.
That's well said, Daniel. There is certainly going to be a range of possible oversight options, all the way from no oversight at all to shutting research down. And you're looking for the sweet spot where subjects are exposed to only risks that are reasonable and that they consent to. And but the problem is the current system protects subjects from risks that don't even exist. And it's just radically unbalanced. I think the best example of this is from one of the early manuals for IRBs. It's not an official manual, but it's influential, which instructs IRBs on how to think about risk. Let's consider an athlete who's part of a physiology experiment. And I think about a young man on a treadmill with those clips on his nose, breathing through a tube so that his oxygen used up can be measured, his exertion remeasured. You can understand how his system responds to stress more precisely. This kind of experiment. This manual says, well, in such an experiment, what are the risks? Well, he could get a black eye. And I'm thinking, well, he certainly could. He could stumble getting off the treadmill, get a black eye. There's no doubt about that. But what does the black eye do? If you have the black eye, as the manual suggests, the subject could become depressed about attending an event wherein wrong inferences might be drawn about the cause of the black eye. Or he could be rejected socially because of the black eye. Or he could be passed over for employment in favor of another candidate who interviewed without a black. My God, the poor guy's losing his job. But it gets worse. This is not the most serious risk. The most serious risk is, and here I got a quote exactly because I don't want to be unfair to the author. The most serious risk is being arrested and interrogated about the possible connection between the black eye and a brutal assault that left a neighbor comatose. My God, he's being interrogated. He's going to confess. He's going to go to prison for life because he was part of this experiment. Of course, this is a serious risk. We have to take it. This is lunacy. And that's why the examples, there are a million experiments where there are important and difficult ethical questions at play. What kind of hope do you offer people who are getting cancer treatments that have a slight chance of working? How do you deal with research in children? How do you deal with research in the demented? These are all tough questions we can argue about all day long. The examples in my book are all ridiculous situations where no committee in its right mind would impose these requirements, and yet it happens every day.
In terms of researchers actually having the ability to appeal IRB decisions, what is the course of what is recourse when a researcher is not able to or does not agree with the decision of an IRB?
Well, let's follow through with the black eye. The IRB system was set up to keep subjects from being abused, meaning subjected to undue experimental risk without consent. The physiology scientist who can say to the IRB, these concerns about the black eye are ridiculous. If the IRB says, we don't care, we think it could happen and we need to be concerned about it. In any ordinary organization in the country, the scientist would be able to say, well, that's what you think. I'm going to ring up your boss and see what she thinks. And would call up the vice dean for research and say, your IRB is making me get these ridiculous consents for this simple physiology study. Would you tell them to back off, please? And she'll say, that can't be. And he'll say, trust me, I'll send you a copy. And she would call the IRB and say, you guys do an important job there. And we support it. But sometimes you get carried away a little bit. Let's just make sure the risks you're worried about are real. In any normal organization, that's what would happen. But not here, because scientists cannot appeal. They can appeal to the original IRB, which may not get them very far, but it is against federal law for a higher official of the institution to review and reverse an unreasonable IRB requirement. It can't be done. And this presumption of IRB infallibility is one of the unique and very interesting aspects of this system.
So there are many stories out there of IRBs requesting a whole bunch of changes from scientists, and that requiring a lot of extra work on the scientist's part. I remember when I was working on some research, we had to shut down the whole lab for a number of days to prepare for the audit, to make sure everything was signed in the proper way with the proper color pen and initialed in the right spot. And all of the consent forms needed to be, this exact font or whatever it is. And you mentioned earlier that you thought that a lot of this had to do with protecting the institution and actually more about liability rather than actually protecting research subjects. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
During the shutdowns of the 1998 to 2001 period, institutions were folded and their funding was cut off for trivial administrative and bookkeeping issues. And OHRP has continued to be very interested in careful documentation of every single aspect, every study. Now, I'm in favor of institutions and scientists doing what they should do, but the amount of attention paid to and the amount of effort demanded by being sure you're in perfect compliance with a set of rules which often seem overall far in excess of what's necessary or appropriate. It's a waste. You saw the waste yourself. We are, and the concern is liability to federal punishment. And the only way to protect against that is to try to hope that you are better documented than the institution down the road, because if OHRP is in the mood to find somebody in default, they will, and you hope it's them and not you. That's like the two guys who see a grizzly bear approaching, and one puts on his running shoes, the other says, "You can't outrun the grizzly." The first one says, "Well, I just need to outrun you."
So my question is about actually calculating out the risk and benefits of IRBs. Like, it sounds like you and Carl Schneider have done a calculation from the ISIS-2 trial to try to say, okay, this is how many lives were presumably lost by this 6 or 9 month delay. And I think that from an institutional liability perspective, I absolutely understand why IRBs and institutions operate the way that they do. For like actually looking at the superstructure, the entire system as a whole, in order to make like the best possible defense of it, you would want to be able to actually say, okay, we know Jesse Gelsinger died as a direct result of participation in medical research. But my question is, how many other people since the initiation of this in the mid 70s, let's say, since after the Tuskegee experiments came out into the open, how many people have actually died? And so the benefits, let's say, of the IRB process versus how many people have died as a result of either delays in research or research that wasn't done.
It's really hard to estimate how many people die as a result of research not being done because the research wasn't done. And that's one of the tough things for this book. If you have a person you can identify as suffering from research harms, like Jesse Gelsinger, you have a very appealing adolescent who liked to play the guitar, liked wrestling videos, was a little bit adolescent-y, once jumped out of the car when his dad was driving him somewhere, but was angry about something. It's a lovable kid, and that just hits your heartstrings. The people who die because research can't be done are unidentifiable. That gets back to the invisible graveyard. And it's very difficult to estimate how many of those there would be. All we know is that there are some, and the number cannot be small. You were asking about the risk of research in general. In the last 20 or 25 years, there have been about 5 people who've died as a result of participating in medical research unexpectedly. That's out of the millions of people who participated. Research is very safe indeed. In fact, an economist might say that research is too safe because maybe there should be more close calls or more questionable situations, but we stay so very safe. We're driving our car at about 5 miles an hour. We'd have more fatalities if we went a little faster, but we'd sure get there a lot sooner.
In Scott Alexander's review of your book, he agrees with many of the points that you're making, but he sort of chalks it up to a larger trend toward bureaucratization and everything becoming more risk averse and, applied to not just to research, but also to building houses or energy infrastructure. A problem pops up, the government or society as a whole is like, okay, we can't have this problem. They put a patch on it. Then another problem pops up. They put a patch on it. And all of a sudden you have 20 patches, and each one of those kind of made sense, but 20 of them in a row just makes it too hard to actually do research or build energy infrastructure or build houses. How do you respond to that? That this isn't just one problem, it's actually a subset of a much larger problem that isn't going to be fixed by any small tweak or even a large tweak.
Well, I think Scott's right. It's a good example of the problem of overregulation. If a problem develops, you set up a system to keep it from happening again. That system is likely to have unintended consequences, including slowing important beneficial things that we want to have. So I agree with him there. But I don't think you should just lie down and say, well, gosh, that's how things are. The political scientists make a distinction between a condition and an issue. A condition is something you have to live with. And scientists nowadays see the IRB system as something they have to live with. There's no way it's going away. The ethicists and the regulators aren't backing on. They just work around it, live with it as best they can. I think that doesn't have to be. I think that if Congress realized how dysfunctional the system is, how it impacts the ability of the scientists in their home districts to do research and to save lives, if the Congress people thought about their loved ones who have Alzheimer's or heart attacks or have premature births, if they realized there was something slowing that research down and there was a relatively straightforward solution, I think they would take it. We have a very polarized Congress, as you guys are probably aware. But I've never met a Republican or a Democrat who didn't care about heart attacks and Alzheimer's disease. And the solution is actually not radical. The solution is to wind the system back to the way it was in the beginning, with committees of reasonable people using their common sense to say, this research is too risky. This research has some risks, but with an appropriate consent process, I think we can let people enroll. And this research requires no further oversight. Go ahead, do it. We're not going to be looking over your shoulder because there is no risk there. We'll just let you do it. And that system is not hard to imagine. We had it at one point. We can have it again. All it takes is an act of Congress.
What would the actual act, I know that you touch a little bit on this in your book, but what specifically would you change in the regulations of OHRP and IRBs in order to have more flexibility and more balancing of subject safety autonomy with society's need for better medical interventions?
Well, you've actually summarized it very nicely. You're looking for a balanced approach that's flexible, that recognizes that subjects need protection and society needs better treatments and better cures. And if that's built into the law from the beginning, that would make all the difference. The law itself, instead of saying a law to protect human subjects, should say a law to promote appropriate research and protect human subjects. If you have both involved from the get-go, that's great. The current system focuses only on protecting research subjects, so of course it's going to go off the rails. It's like a car where you have two drivers, one on each side, and each has a brake. There's no gas pedal. Well, it's not going to go very far. You need to have balance. You need to recognize the value of research. And that's an ethical point too, because there is an ethical advantage in saving people from unnecessary death and suffering.
How have your colleagues reacted to your campaign to, I guess you're not in the same camp as Schneider, where you want to abolish the IRB, but reforming the IRB?
No, I think we need an IRB, but we need a sensible one. I was once asked to be part of a study of how doctors use the electronic medical record. And this nice young scientist came to my office and he pulled out a clipboard. He said, "Now, I'm going to read you some questions and you can refuse to answer any question you want to." And I said, stop right there. I'll just sign it. He said, "No, I've got to read you everything." and you may find some of these questions intrusive and you don't have to answer anything. You can end the interview at any time. And I said, stop. And I went over to him and I said, "My main interest is the IRB, which makes you have forms like this, makes you read to the people, makes you feel like an idiot, makes your subjects feel that you're wasting their time. If I have my way, you'll never have to do this again." He leaned back for a sec. His eyes got really big. He said, "Well, then you would be a god." And, there's so much research that's so important and that's so free of risk. The kind of research that medical students and interns and residents used to do routinely can no longer be done, because by the time you've gotten approval from the IRB to do your research, which has no risk, you're off rotation. That's a tremendous loss in training. I have spoken with many doctors in training, asked, "Where are you going?" They say, "I'm going to the big local cancer institution." I said, "Have you thought about staying in the medical school and doing research?" A lot of times the answer is they've heard too many bad things about how the IRB makes research difficult, slows things down, and just made the life of a scientist not worth pursuing. They'd rather just be a clinician, see patients, make money. We lose those young people. We're losing tomorrow's potential. That's a great loss.
Do you think that it was a mistake to have 3 things that needed to be balanced in the Belmont Report: autonomy, beneficence, and justice? Do you think if you just simplified it to autonomy, that a lot of these issues would be less important, where instead of the IRB where basically the IRB gets to allow people to make their own decisions when it comes to whether they want to participate in research, and trust them to decide things?
That's a great point, Daniel, because in fact, subject autonomy is not respected by the current system. You are not given the chance to enroll in research that the IRB thinks it's too risky for you. You might think it's not too risky. You might want to do it. But if the IRB says no, they abridge your autonomy and they don't let you even consider it. The COVID challenge trials are the best example of that. There are many thousands of young people who have volunteered to be vaccinated against COVID and then deliberately given the disease to prove vaccine effectiveness. Their risk would be real because COVID's a serious disease even in young people, but far less than older people. And they've been making an important contribution. The U.S. system does not allow that research to proceed, and I think we missed a big opportunity. So autonomy has been put by the wayside, and we should bring it back. We should give people choice.
Okay, now for a few rapid fire questions. First is, what is one medical truth that few of your colleagues agree with you on?
A medical truth, not a research truth, not an IRB truth, but a medical truth?
We can broaden it. We can broaden it.
I'm a pretty conventional doctor. If there's a party line on how to do something, my default assumption is I'll do what the official cookbook says to do. And if I see a doctor that I think is practicing cookbook medicine, I say, this is the person I want to keep seeing. Because the cookbooks were written with great care by people who've given a lot of thought to this particular issue. That doesn't mean you never deviate from it. Of course, there are special circumstances, but I like standard ways of doing things because overall they save lives.
If you had unlimited funds to run a single randomized controlled trial, what would you fund?
I'd have to have unlimited power also. Can I get that too?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'll divide the U.S. into two systems, into two parts, A and B. Part A will have the IRB system. Part B will have a modified system that's not quite so severe. And we'll see how many subjects die, how much research is done, how many lives are saved. And then we'll put the IRB system itself to a randomized controlled trial.
The one thing that would be interesting there is the part that has an IRB system would still benefit from the research conducted in the alternative part, which is what's so unusual about the US because there's so much research conducted here. The rest of the world, to greater or lesser extent, relies on innovation here for developments there. So that, yeah, anyhow, just a little confounder.
I'll put you on the steering committee.
All right, last question. What should we have asked you during this interview, but we didn't?
Oh, well, what can people do? The answer is complain. Write your senator, write your member of Congress and say, I understand this is a system that's a problem, and why aren't you doing something about it? That would be great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us on the External Medicine podcast. If people are interested in learning more about you and the work that you do, they should obviously get this book, From Oversight to Overkill, which is available on Amazon and I assume a local bookstore near you. Where else, if people are interested in learning more, would you direct them to go on the internet?
I do have a website, drsimonwhitney.com. And there's not much about the problems of the IRB system on the internet because it's such a hidden problem. I call it hidden because most doctors have never heard of the IRB system. It's strictly a problem for the scientists who do the research. And so if you ask your doctor, is this a problem? She's likely to say, what's an IRB? Unless you're in a university setting, if you're seeing a university physician, then she will roll her eyes and say, yes, that is a problem.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. We do not endorse any healthcare providers or treatments. Our views do not represent the views of any official organization or institution. If you'd like to support us, subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, preferably a phenomenal review. Visit us at externalmedicinepodcast.com and tell your friends.